We've already heard mentioned several times the famous cast iron guarantee. Sun newspaper, September 2007, if I remember, a cast iron guarantee. No ifs, no buts, no maybes. When it comes to the point, oh, well, of course, but the treaty's been ratified, so there's no point in having a referendum now, is there? Have you ever heard a weaker excuse? Promises, promises, and then we get the manifestos for the last general election. Guarantee of a referendum on the European issue. Did it happen? No, it didn't. It's worse than that. Not only did the referendum not happen, but actually when there was a vote in Westminster calling for a referendum, what happened? Cameron's Conservatives whipped their own MPs to vote against a referendum, despite the fact that it had been in their manifesto. And it's not only in Westminster. We also had a Conservative manifesto commitment to oppose the European Diplomatic Service, the European External Action Service, as they call it. That was our party policy, to oppose it. Now, we had a vote on this question in the European Parliament, and I was sitting there looking at the list. You know, we all have lists of how we have to vote. You may say, why don't you make the decisions decision by decision, one at a time? But when you're voting on 800 amendments in the course of an hour and a half, you really don't have time to read them and make a decision. You do need a little guidance. But where there is an important vote, as for example on the diplomatic service, we usually check in advance and we know where it's going to come. And I was looking down, I knew where it was, and we were whipped to vote in favour of the European Diplomatic Service. And I turned round to Charles Tannock, who's our foreign affairs spokesman. At least they regard the European Union as foreign. I suppose that's something. I turned round to him and I said, we got the vote wrong here, we're supposed to be voting against. Oh no, he said, Westminster has asked us to vote in favour. So that was another turnaround. Let's take another commitment. When we had the coalition agreement, it was extremely difficult for the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats to agree about anything with regard to Europe. There was only one thing. They agreed that both Conservative and Liberal Democrat would oppose the famous travelling circus, the monthly movement of the European Parliament between Brussels and Strasbourg, which, as I'm sure you all know, costs about £200 million a year. At least they had the common sense to say in the coalition agreement that they would oppose that. So when a group of MEPs in the Parliament managed to get a decision made by the Parliament not to stop it, but to cut it down from 12 times a year to 11 times a year, and when the French government, trying to defend Strasbourg, took the European Parliament to court, and when there was an opportunity for member states to make representations to the court for or against, and a couple of member states supported France, was our coalition government there on behalf of the UK saying, no, we've got to stop this nonsense and this waste? No, they sat on their hands. When I inquired afterwards why they had done so, you know the reason was, well, we thought it was a bad time to upset the French. Do you think there is anybody there in the Quai d'Orsay who is sitting around saying, let's not upset the British? I don't think that's the case. But if we look at Cameron on the issues, on Europe he is, or has been, effectively a complete sellout. I sat opposite him in a room with the Conservative delegation about 7 or 8 months ago. He came to visit us in his capacity as Prime Minister, and we each had an opportunity to do a question. It wasn't really a debate because the time was limited, but a quick question. I said, Prime Minister, I said, the Conservatives who selected me and supported me and campaigned for me in the East Midlands, they think we ought to have a referendum on Europe. What about it? And he said, no, he said, I don't want a referendum on Europe because we are better off in. That is his position. And if you think about it, he is wrong twice. Of course we're not better off in. I don't have to argue that case here. But also, why do you have referendums? You do not have them to confirm the prejudices of the Prime Minister. You have them because you want to give the British people an opportunity to have their say. This is a Prime Minister who has told very clearly, his backbenchers that if they support leaving the European Union, if they sign up to Better Off Out, they can remain Conservative MPs, but they will never get promotion, they will never get a hand on the slippery pole. So you've got really good sound guys like Douglas Carswell, who has no hope of ever making any progress through the ranks of the Conservative Parliamentary Party because he believes, as we believe, that we are better off out. But it isn't. Well, you talk to him about that. It isn't just Europe, and a lot of people have made the point today, quite rightly, that UKIP is still seen out there by many people, especially in the media, as a single issue party. And Alexandra was again quite right. She says it's important, in my view, if I can, as a brand new today member of UKIP, if I can offer a word of advice, we do need to think about broadening that out so people stop saying to us in radio interviews, but you're a single issue party. Okay, we're not. Let's take another issue. That is climate and energy. Now, my big issue for the whole of my parliamentary career obviously has been Europe and Britain's position in Europe and getting Britain out. But over the last 5 years or so, a huge issue for me has been the whole question of climate and energy policy. I had a conference in Brussels. I had Lord Lawson, and I had Professor Fred Singer, an American atmospheric physicist, and a group of other luminaries of the climate skeptic campaign, and I had them in Brussels. We had a session there that was very successful, and since then I've been campaigning on this issue. I got a confession to make. I am what the Guardian newspaper calls a climate change denier. Of course, I'm not a climate change denier. Anybody who denies the plain fact that the climate changes would have to be mad. The climate has always changed. It will always change. The question is, why does it change? The reason they call me a denier is because, in my personal view, and I'm not a scientist, I used to be a mathematician, I'm not a scientist, but I have read the available research in considerable detail. In my view, human activity has little or no impact on the climate, and therefore the things we are doing are essentially pretty much a waste of time. But I want you to do a little thought experiment for me. Just set aside your view, if you share my view. Let's set that aside a moment. Let's assume that CO2 emissions are a threat to the planet. What would you try and do? What you would try and do is you would say, let us find a way of reducing CO2 emissions as efficiently as possible, as low cost as possible, doing the least possible damage to the economy. That's what you would do. Now the problems start, as so many problems start, of course, with Brussels. Brussels has decided that we're going to have targets for renewables. Well, why renewables? Why not low carbon generation? In which case, nuclear would be on the same level as wind farms. And by the way, as we all know, energy from nuclear power stations is a hell of a lot cheaper. But we don't do that. We actually say, no, we're going to use renewables. Nobody's explained why we use renewables, in preference, say, to other low-carbon technologies, but that's what they say. And I don't need to talk to you about wind farms. We all know what's wrong with them. Recent research is indicating that they probably save almost zero CO2, because, as you know, they're intermittent. You have to back them up, usually with gas. Gas run intermittently to back up wind is itself inefficient, generates more CO2 than you need to, and costs more than you need to. And you're building the capacity twice. I say to people who want to build wind farms, you'll need the gas backup capacity. Why not just build the gas and forget about the wind farms? But recently, 100 plus members of Parliament in Westminster wrote to the Prime Minister asking him to reconsider the policy on green energy and green energy subsidies, and he wrote back a letter. And by the way, I and other colleagues also wrote a supporting letter which was published in the Telegraph last week. I don't know whether you happened to notice it. Cameron wrote back, and indeed he very kindly sent me a copy of the letter, in which he said that despite European Union rules, even without European Union rules, we would still want wind farms as part of our energy mix, because they delivered energy security and because they created green jobs. Now, is that ignorance or pig-headedness, or what is it? They do not deliver energy security because we will not build all the 30,000 wind turbines that Chris Hoon, God bless him, wanted to build. We will fail to build them, but if we plan on their availability then we will be short of electricity, and we're not building the backup, so we'll be short of electricity anyway. The current plan, making a high proportion of British electricity generation dependent upon wind farms, is a guarantee of power outages and shortages and blackouts by the end of the decade. It is madness. There is just no excuse for that policy, but just as with Europe, Cameron doesn't engage with the debate. He just says, oh, well, Europe's important for trade. Similarly with wind farms, Cameron does not engage with the debate. He either doesn't know or hasn't bothered to find out. We know, by the way, that green jobs are not created by wind farms. There are several pieces of research showing that one green job costs 2 or 3 real jobs in the real economy, because the high cost of green renewable electricity depresses economic growth. And in any case, a great part of the equipment for these renewable energy projects is actually made in China anyway. So, you know, if we want to give money to China, well, that's a great thing, but we're giving enough money away in foreign aid as things are. I talked about Europe. I've talked about Europe, I've talked about energy, which for me is a key policy. By the way, I don't want you to run away with the idea that I don't care about the environment. I feel I've done my bit. I actually went as far as I bought a green car. British Racing Green. And I enjoyed burning the gas on the way up here from Leicestershire, I tell you. But it's not just those 2 issues, it's a load of other issues. It's defence. I won't go into it because we could talk for half an hour about defence. It's foreign aid, that's been raised already, and I can sense the mood of the meeting. It's immigration that's already been covered. There are a whole load of tax issues where they've got it completely wrong. It's the lack of a growth strategy and a lack of a deregulation policy. It's university admissions, it's grammar schools, it's transport policy. And I got to the stage, ladies and gentlemen, when I said to myself, which bit of Conservative policy do I support? I think IDS is doing some pretty good things with welfare. I think Gove is doing some fairly good things with schools, although the university thing worries me and the grammar schools thing. But on the great, broad picture of policy, I found I was unable to support the Conservative Party, and I think it was at that point that I decided to make a move. But that's my story and that's history. Let's look at the future. Again, we've heard from earlier speakers that there is a change of mood amongst the British public, and that is clear. I think 5 years ago, my colleagues, my Conservative colleagues, were telling me, Helmer, you're obsessed with Europe. Now, you go out and do the research. Ask voters what they think matters. They care about immigration, they care about jobs, they care about health, they care about pensions, they care about education. They don't care about Europe. It's item 12, 13, 14, 15, way down the list. And of course I replied that, as we all know, Europe may be number 12 on the list for the voters, but in fact Europe, Brussels, affects all those items on the top of the list. And obviously the big opportunity for all of us is going to be the 2014 Euro election. I have to share one little insight on that with you from my good friend and colleague Dan Hannan, who said he thought maybe the 2014 European election wouldn't take place, and that if it did, it would certainly be the last one in this country. I suspect he may be right at that. But it is a huge opportunity. Last time, UKIP came second, beating Labour into third place. That was an incredible achievement. The objective, surely next time, must actually be to beat the Conservatives into second place and see UKIP come third. As you know, I was selected and elected by East Midlands Conservatives 3 times over the course of my parliamentary history. They agree with what I am saying. They do not agree with what David Cameron is doing. And I believe, therefore, that I will have a role to play working with you in that campaign to get the UKIP message across. If I can just say in conclusion, I believe that the British people have the ability and the right and the duty and the manifest destiny to govern themselves in an independent and democratic country. That is where the future is. I was born in the closing years of the Second World War, while Britain was marching on to victory against one of the worst tyrannies of the 20th century, a tyranny, by the way, based in Berlin. I was born I was born into a Britain that was free and independent and democratic. And ladies and gentlemen, all I ask is the right to die in a Britain that is free and independent and democratic.